The bodyguard was fired after taking a bullet for his boss, but what the mafia boss's daughter revealed left the underworld in shock. The duffel bag hit the wet pavement when he heard the order that would end his life of service. Joel Stanley never imagined that after 5 years of standing in the line of fire for the Kehoe family, he would be cast out like a traitor. He tightened his grip on his meager belongings, his jaw clenched to hold back the roar of betrayal. No one understood why he was being exiled until Sungwoo Kehoe's daughter finally broke her silence, and what she revealed completely shattered the most powerful man in the city. If you're feeling the weight of this injustice, drop a comment below and subscribe for more stories of loyalty and redemption. Now let's continue. The weight of a false accusation is heavier than any duffel bag. Joel Stanley walked down the rain-slicked steps of the Kehoe estate, counting each one as if the rhythm could dull the throbbing pain in his wounded shoulder. 12 steps from the mahogany doors to the iron gate. 12 heavy footfalls to leave behind 5 years of blood, sweat, and silence. The city's neon lights reflected off the puddles in a cold electric blue. Joel thought of how he had always guarded this gate at this hour, watching the light flicker in Sun-hee's bedroom window as he patrolled the perimeter. He had taught her how to spot the constellations from that balcony, the Great Bear, the Hunter, the North Star. He didn't look back at that window now. If he did, he knew his resolve would crumble. He had already packed his life into a single bag in the damp basement quarters. 2 tactical suits, a few worn t-shirts, the silver watch Sungwoo gave him after the first year, and the small wooden tiger Sun-hee had carved for him last Christmas. The tiger he left behind on the nightstand. It belonged to the man he used to be, the protector who was no longer wanted. The driver was waiting by the gate, the engine of the black SUV idling like a growling beast. He was a veteran of the organization, a man who had seen everything, but the way he looked at Joel now was filled with a hollow confusion. He didn't understand. No one did. And that was the cruelest part, because if anyone asked Joel why he was leaving, he had no answer to give. Sungwoo Kehoe had simply summoned him to the cold marble study that morning. In a voice as sharp as a razor and eyes as dead as stones, the boss had declared Joel a liability and a snake. No evidence was shown, no defense was heard, not even the mercy of a handshake. Joel stepped into the back seat and leaned his head against the glass. The estate grew smaller in the rain, and with it, the only home he had ever known. He had arrived here a broken soldier looking for a purpose, and he was leaving the same way, except now his heart was bleeding faster than his wound ever had. The heavy silence of the study was more suffocating than the humidity of the rain-drenched night outside. Sungwoo Kehoe sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock, each second feeling like a hammer blow to the loyalty Joel had built over 5 long years. Joel stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his posture military straight, despite the fire burning in his left shoulder. The wound from the sniper's bullet was still fresh, the bandages beneath his suit jacket likely dampened by a mix of blood and sweat, but he refused to flinch. He had taken that hit for the man sitting across from him, and now he was being treated like a common thief.
Without a word, Sungwoo reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single cream-colored envelope. He didn't hand it over. He didn't offer a final handshake or a look of gratitude for the life Joel had preserved. Instead, he flicked his wrist with a gesture of utter disgust, and the envelope slid across the polished wood, spinning until it fell off the edge and landed on the floor at Joel's feet. It was the final paycheck, the price of his exile. "Your things are already at the gate," Sungwoo said, his voice devoid of the warmth Joel had heard when they shared drinks after successful operations. Now it was the voice of the boss, a man who dealt in betrayals and cold finales. "I suggest you take what's left of your dignity and disappear before I decide that a severance package is too generous for a man who sold my coordinates to the highest bidder." Joel looked down at the envelope. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight, pressing against his chest until it was hard to breathe. He wanted to speak. He wanted to tell Sung-woo that he had been there for every late-night fever Sun-hee had suffered, that he had checked the perimeter 4 times every night when Sung-woo was away, and that he had never once looked at the Kehoe accounts with anything but protective intent. But the words died in his throat. He saw the flicker of Kenji standing in the shadows of the doorway, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on the second-in-command's lips. Joel realized then that the lie was already too deep. To beg for his job would be to admit a guilt he didn't possess. Joel bent down slowly, his shoulder screaming in protest as he retrieved the envelope. He didn't look at the amount. It didn't matter. He tucked it into the side pocket of his tailored jacket, the same jacket that still bore the faint scent of the gunpowder from the night he saved Sung-woo's life. He looked up, his eyes meeting Sung-woo's for the last time. He saw the conflict there, the furrowed brow of a man trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. But the pride of the mafia boss was a wall Joel could no longer climb. "I served the family, not the business," Joel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely vibrated in the quiet room. It was the only defense he would offer. He turned on his heel and walked out of the study. The hallway felt miles long. Every portrait on the wall, every antique vase felt like a witness to his shame. He reached the small servant's entrance where his leather duffel bag sat waiting. It was light, the belongings of a man who never expected to stay, yet had given everything as if he would. As he stepped out onto the porch, the cold rain lashed at his face, mingling with the salt of a single tear he refused to let fall. He gripped the handle of his bag so hard his knuckles turned white. From the corner of his eye, he saw a movement at the upstairs window. A small, pale hand was pressed against the glass. Sun-hee. She was watching him leave, her eyes wide and glossed with a heartbreak she didn't yet have the words to explain. Joel clenched his jaw, the muscle leaping in his cheek. He didn't wave. He couldn't. If he acknowledged her, he would turn back, and he knew the guards, men he had trained himself, had orders to stop him. He stepped off the porch and into the downpour, the counting beginning in his head. 1 step for the loyalty he'd given. 2 steps for the blood he'd shed. By the time he reached the gate, the counting was the only thing keeping his heart from shattering completely. He was a ghost now, walking away from the only people who had made him feel human in a world of monsters.
The rain outside the SUV blurred the world into streaks of gray, but in the reflection of the window, Joel didn't see the city. He saw the gala. The memory hit him with the same visceral force as the lead that had torn through his shoulder 6 months ago. It had been the night of the Blue Moon Foundation Gala, an evening of silk ties, forced smiles, and the heavy metallic scent of expensive cologne masking the tension underneath. Sung-woo Kehoe had been at the height of his power, standing on the marble balcony of the Grand Metropolitan, glass of vintage whiskey in hand, unaware that he was perfectly framed by the crosshairs of a rifle 3 blocks away. Joel had been standing 3 paces behind him, as he always was. He hadn't been looking at the glitter of the city, or the beautiful women in their designer gowns. He had been watching the way the light glinted off a rooftop across the square. It was a tiny, unnatural flicker, a lens flare that shouldn't have been there. In the world of high-stakes security, a second is an eternity. Joel didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He knew that by the time he pulled Sung-woo to the ground, the bullet would already be through his boss's heart. With a surge of movement that defied his calm exterior, Joel lunged forward. He didn't just push Sung-woo, he used his own body as a human shield, throwing himself across the space between the gunman and the target. The sound of the shot was a sharp, dry crack that echoed like a whip against the stone. Then came the impact. It wasn't the stinging pain people imagined. It was a heavy, numbing punch that threw Joel backward against the balcony railing. He remembered the warmth of his own blood instantly soaking through his pristine white shirt, spreading like a blooming rose against the fabric. He remembered the look on Sung-woo's face, not of a cold boss, but of a man who had just seen a miracle. As the chaos erupted and the screams of socialites filled the air, Joel had stayed upright just long enough to ensure Sung-woo was behind the safety of the reinforced glass. He had ignored the red haze at the edges of his vision, his hand going to his concealed weapon, even as his strength failed. "Stay down, sir," Joel had whispered, his voice steady even as his lungs burned. He had held the line until the rest of the security detail arrived, refusing to fall until he knew the perimeter was locked. It was that night that Sung-woo had looked at him with something resembling brotherhood. In the hospital afterward, the boss had sat by his bed for 3 hours in total silence, a silent acknowledgement that Joel Stanley was the only person in the world who would die for him without asking the price. Now, as the SUV hit a pothole, the jolt sent a spike of real physical pain through that same shoulder, pulling Joel back to the present. He adjusted his suit jacket, feeling the thick, puckered skin of the exit wound beneath his shirt. The scar was a permanent map of his loyalty, a map that Sung-woo had chosen to ignore. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He had carried the lead meant for Sung-woo's heart, only for Sung-woo to break his own heart 6 months later. He closed his eyes, trying to push the memory back into the dark. The gala had been the moment he thought he had earned a home. He had mistaken a debt of gratitude for a bond of family. As the car sped further away from the Kehoe estate, Joel realized that scars were the only things that stayed loyal. They didn't listen to lies, they didn't believe traitors, and they never, ever forgot the cost of a life. While Joel's car disappeared into the gray curtain of the rain, the atmosphere inside the Kehoe study shifted from cold grief to a calculated, poisonous triumph. Kenji, the second in command, whose loyalty was as sharp and shallow as a mirror, stepped out from the shadows where he had been lurking like a predator. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, rhythmic confidence of a man who had spent months weaving a web and was finally watching his prey struggle. Sung-woo remained at his desk, his head buried in his hands. The weight of the gala memory, the memory of Joel bleeding for him, was clearly warring with the facts he had been presented. Kenji knew that in the world of the mafia, doubt was a crack that could bring down an empire. He just had to keep pouring the poison into it. "He was always too quiet, boss," Kenji murmured, his voice smooth and soothing, like silk over a blade. He walked to the desk and placed a high-end tablet in front of Sung-woo. A man who says nothing is usually a man who has too much to hide. We wanted to believe the Silent Protector Act, but the digital trail doesn't lie. With a practiced swipe of his finger, Kenji brought up a series of encrypted bank statements. They were masterpieces of forgery, ghost accounts linked to Joel's name, showing massive offshore transfers that coincided perfectly with the security breaches of the last 6 months. The numbers were staggering, enough to make any man look like a mercenary. These came from a Cayman account linked to the rival syndicate, Kenji continued, leaning down so his shadow fell across Sung-woo's shoulders. The same people who hired the sniper at the gala. Think about it, Sung-woo. Why was the shot so clean? Why did Joel know exactly where to move? It wasn't a rescue. It was a performance. He took a non-lethal hit to earn your absolute trust, to become the one man you would never question. He didn't save your life. He bought your soul with a flesh wound. Sung-woo looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrifying, hollow anger. The logic was perverse, but in his world it made sense. Betrayal was the only currency that never devalued.
"He sat in my house," Sung-woo whispered, the words sounding like breaking glass. "He played with my daughter." "That was the insurance policy," Kenji whispered back, his eyes gleaming. "He knew you wouldn't kill a man your daughter loved. He used Sun-hee as a shield, just as much as he used his own body. He's a professional boss, and professionals know that the best way to destroy a man is from the inside out."
Kenji reached out and tapped a final document on the screen. A GPS log supposedly recovered from Joel's private phone, showing him meeting with rival lieutenants in the dead of night. It was all a lie, a digital phantom created by Kenji's own hackers. But to a man blinded by the fear of being made a fool, it was the final nail in the coffin. Sung-woo grabbed the edge of the mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned. The betrayal felt worse than the sniper's bullet. That had only hit his shoulder. This hit his pride, his family, and his legacy. He didn't see the way Kenji's hand hovered near his own pocket, fingering the silver lighter he had used to signal the assassins that very night. He didn't see the snake in his own garden because he was too busy looking at the wall Joel had built to protect him. "He's gone," Sung-woo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low frequency. "Make sure he stays gone. If he ever steps foot in this city again, I don't want a report. I want a head." Kenji bowed his head, hiding the smile that threatened to break across his face. "Of course, boss. I'll handle everything. You just focus on the transition. The Empire needs a hand that won't hesitate, a hand that isn't tied to a ghost." As Kenji turned to leave the room, the grandfather clock struck the hour. The sound was funereal. In the silence that followed, the only person left in the house who knew the truth was a 5-year-old girl hiding behind the heavy velvet curtains, her small heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had seen the tablet, she had seen Kenji's smile, and she knew that the man her father called a traitor was the only one who had ever truly kept them safe. The silence that followed Joel's departure was not the peaceful quiet of a secured home. It was a heavy, hollow void that seemed to echo through the corridors of the Kehoe estate. For 5 years, Joel had been the mansion's heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic presence that ensured the world stayed outside the gates. Now that heartbeat had stopped, and the house felt less like a fortress and more like a mausoleum. Sun-hee had retreated to her bedroom the moment the gates clicked shut behind Joel's car, and she hadn't emerged since. The colorful drawings of stars and tigers that Joel had helped her color were taped to her door, acting as a paper-thin barrier to a world she no longer trusted. When the house staff brought up a tray of her favorite honey-glazed chicken, they found the door locked. No amount of coaxing, no promises of extra dessert or bedtime stories could elicit a response. The only sound from behind the wood was the soft, rhythmic creak of her rocking chair, a lonely, repetitive sound that signaled a child trying to soothe a pain she couldn't name. Sung-woo stood in the hallway staring at his daughter's closed door. He was a man who moved mountains and silenced rivals with a single word, yet he felt utterly powerless against the silence of a 5-year-old. The luxury gold watch on his wrist ticked away the hours, each second a reminder of how quickly his perfect life was fraying at the edges. He felt a sudden sharp chill crawl up his spine, a sensation he hadn't felt since his early days in the underworld. Without Joel standing guard at the end of the hall, the shadows in the corners of the mansion seemed longer and darker. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the colonial-style windows made Sung-woo's hand instinctively reach for the holster he wasn't wearing. He realized, with a surge of irritation, that Joel hadn't just been a bodyguard, he had been the house's sense of gravity. Joel was the one who knew which floorboards groaned under a stranger's weight and which windows rattled in a storm.
Without him, the house felt exposed, as if the very walls had become transparent to the enemies circling outside.
Sungwoo walked downstairs to the main hall, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the marble. He looked toward the front door, half expecting to see Joel's rugged, quiet silhouette framed against the light, his head slightly tilted as he listened for threats no one else could hear. Instead, he saw Kenji's new security team, men in crisp, identical suits who stood with a rigid, professional distance. They were technically perfect, but they lacked the quiet sacrifice Joel carried in his eyes. They were guards, but they weren't protectors. They stood at the post, but they didn't hold the line. The mansion, once filled with the warmth of Sun Hee's laughter and the unspoken brotherhood shared over late-night debriefs, had become a cold, clinical business center. The fierce amber gold of the sunset had faded into a bruising purple dusk, and as the lights flickered on, they felt clinical and artificial. Sungwoo poured himself a glass of whiskey in the library, the same room where he had thrown the paycheck at Joel's feet. He tried to tell himself he had done what was necessary. He tried to focus on the evidence Kenji had provided, but the drink tasted like ash. He looked at the empty chair by the door where Joel used to sit during long nights of planning. The post was empty. The guardian was gone. And as the wind began to howl through the trees outside, Sungwoo Kiho, the most powerful man in the city, realized for the first time that he was completely alone in a house full of strangers. Inside the darkened sanctuary of her bedroom, Sun Hee sat on the floor, her back pressed against the mahogany frame of her bed. She wasn't playing with her dolls or coloring the stars. She was staring at the heavy velvet curtains, her mind pulled back to the night the world broke. Her father thought she had been tucked safely in bed when the gunfire shattered the peace of the estate. But Sun Hee had always been a creature of shadows, a quiet observer of a world far too loud for a 5-year-old. That night, she had crept down the stairs to find her father, hoping for one last glass of water or a quick hug before sleep. She had reached the heavy oak doors of the study just as the first alarm blared. Panic had seized her, but it was the instinct of a mafia boss's daughter that took over. She hadn't run for the stairs. She had scrambled under the massive claw-footed desk in the corner of the room, pulling the long tablecloth down to hide her trembling frame. From her hiding spot, the world was reduced to a series of polished shoes and muffled voices. She remembered the smell of expensive tobacco and the sudden sharp ozone scent of a discharge. Through a small gap in the fabric, she had watched the chaos unfold. She saw her father standing by the window, a target silhouetted against the moon. And then she saw Joel. He had moved like a blur of dark fabric, his body a shield that didn't hesitate. She remembered the sound of his breath, a sharp, pained grunt as the bullet found his shoulder. She had covered her mouth with both hands to keep from screaming, her eyes wide as she watched him stumble but refuse to fall. He had stayed between her father and the glass, a wall of pure, unyielding loyalty. But it wasn't the shooting that haunted her now. It was what happened in the frantic minutes after Joel had been rushed out to the medical bay. The study had been empty for a moment, or so she thought. Then, the clicking of heels on the hardwood floor reached her ears. Kenji. He hadn't been checking for assassins or helping the wounded. He had walked straight to the desk, right above where Sun Hee lay shivering. She saw his hand reach out, but he wasn't looking for a weapon. He was holding a silver lighter, the metal glinting in the emergency lights. He flicked it open and shut, a nervous, rhythmic habit. Then he had leaned over the desk and picked up a burner phone Joel had left behind in the struggle. Sun Hee watched as Kenji's fingers flew across the screen. He wasn't checking messages, he was typing them. She didn't understand the words, but she saw the look on his face. It wasn't the look of a worried friend or a loyal soldier. It was the look of a boy who had finally stolen the crown. He had smiled, a cold, jagged expression that made her blood run like ice. He had planted something.
She didn't know what a digital trail or a bank transfer was, but she knew the difference between a protector and a predator. She had seen Kenji drop a small black device behind the radiator, and she had heard him whisper to someone on his own phone, "The shield is cracked. He's as good as dead." Sun-hee huddled tighter into herself as the memory faded back into the cold reality of her empty room. She realized now that the silence she had kept wasn't just from trauma, it was from fear. She knew that if she spoke, the man with the silver lighter would look at her the same way he looked at the empty chair in the hallway. But as she looked at the wooden tiger Joel had carved for her, sitting lonely on the nightstand, the fear began to burn into something else. She remembered Joel's eyes, the way they always softened when he looked at her, the way he never treated her like a burden or a secret. He was out there in the rain, alone and bleeding because of the man with the silver lighter. She crawled toward the door, her small hand reaching for the lock. The house was cold and vulnerable, and her father was blinded by a lie. She was the only one who had seen the truth from beneath the desk. She was the only witness to the night the snake had bitten the hand that fed it. And for the first time since the gates had closed, Sun-hee Kiho decided that she would no longer be silent. The predator no longer felt the need to hide in the tall grass. With Joel Stanley gone, the air in the Kiho mansion felt thinner, weaker, as if the very oxygen of the estate had been drained away. Kenji stood in the upstairs gallery, looking down at the main hall where his new recruits stood like statues. They were his men now, loyal to his payroll, not to the Kiho name. To Sung-woo, they looked like a fresh start, but to Kenji, they were the cleanup crew for a transition of power that was only hours away. Kenji reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver lighter, flicking the lid open and shut with a metallic snick-snick that echoed through the empty hallway. He felt a surge of intoxicating adrenaline. For years, he had played the role of the loyal shadow, the diligent student, and the grateful brother. He had watched Joel earn the scars he believed he deserved, and he had watched Sung-woo grow soft behind the high walls of the estate. The mafia boss had become a father, and in Kenji's world, a father was just a target with a permanent distraction. He walked toward the north wing, his footsteps silent on the expensive rugs. He wasn't headed to the study this time, he was headed to the security hub. The room was the brain of the mansion, where every camera feed and motion sensor was monitored. The technician inside, a man Kenji had personally selected to replace Joel's lead operator, didn't even look up as the second-in-command entered. "The blind spots?" Kenji asked, his voice a low, jagged whisper. "Set," the technician replied, tapping a key. "The perimeter cameras on the east side will loop for 10 minutes starting at midnight. The silent alarms in the master suite have been rerouted to my private terminal. No one outside this room will know if a door opens or a window breaks." Kenji nodded, a cold, thin smile stretched across his face. It was almost too easy. Sung-woo was currently drowning his sorrows in a bottle of expensive scotch, lamenting the betrayal of a man who would have died for him. The boss was vulnerable, blinded by the very lies Kenji had fed him. He was so busy mourning a ghost that he couldn't see the demon standing right beside him. Kenji moved to the window and looked out at the grounds where Joel had bled for the family 6 months ago. He felt a flicker of contempt. Joel had been a fool, a man who valued a code over a crown. Kenji wouldn't make that mistake. He wouldn't take a bullet for anyone. He would be the one giving the orders to pull the trigger. He pulled out his phone and sent a short, encrypted message to the rival syndicate, the same men who had hired the sniper at the gala. "The shield is removed. The gates are open. Midnight." The plan was surgical. At midnight, a breach would occur on the east side. Kenji would lead his new security team to investigate, leaving the main house and Sung-woo completely unprotected. By the time the smoke cleared, Sung-woo would be dead. Joel would be the official scapegoat for the second successful hit, and Kenji would step in to save the organization from the chaos.
He would be the hero who rebuilt the Kiho Empire from the ashes of its fallen leader. There was only one loose thread left, Sun Hee. Kenji's eyes darkened as he thought of the girl. She was the only thing Sung Woo loved more than his power. Kenji knew he couldn't just leave her alive to become a rallying point for those still loyal to her father's memory. She would have to go to the boarding school in Switzerland he had mentioned, or perhaps somewhere even more permanent. He flicked his lighter one last time, the small flame dancing in the reflection of the glass. The shield was gone, the sword was in his hand, and the king was drunk on his own grief. The move was set. By dawn, the name Kiho would belong to history, and the city would learn that a snake doesn't need to be bigger than a lion to kill it. It just needs to wait until the lion closes its eyes. Kenji turned away from the window, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floorboards. He walked toward the master suite, the silver lighter tucked away, his heart beating with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking bomb. The countdown to midnight had begun. The grandfather clock in the foyer began its slow, heavy toll for midnight, each chime sounding like a funeral bell for the Kiho legacy. Sung Woo sat in the darkened library, the amber liquor in his glass untouched, his eyes fixed on the empty space by the door where Joel should have been. The silence of the house was absolute, until the heavy oak door creaked open. Sun Hee stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim hall light. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. Behind her, Kenji appeared, his hand resting with a deceptive gentleness on her shoulder. He looked like the picture of a concerned uncle, but the silver lighter in his other hand was flicking open and shut, snick, 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 the flame dancing like a demon's tongue in the shadows. "She wouldn't stay in her room, boss," Kenji said, his voice smooth and oily. "I think the stress of Joel's betrayal is finally catching up to her. I'll take her back upstairs so you can have your peace." Sung Woo looked at his daughter, his heart aching at her silence. "Come here, Sun Hee," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand.
But Sun Hee didn't move toward her father. Her eyes were locked on the silver lighter in Kenji's hand. In the flickering light of the library's fireplace, she saw the engraving on the side, a small, coiled viper. It was the same flash of silver she had seen through the keyhole on the night of the gala. It was the same lighter she had seen Kenji use to signal the man in the black van across the street just seconds before the bullets shattered the glass. The trauma that had locked her throat for months finally burned away under the heat of a pure, righteous fury. As Kenji reached out to pull her away, she wrenched herself free and pointed a trembling finger directly at the silver lighter. "Liar!" she screamed. The sound was raw and guttural, a voice that hadn't been used in weeks tearing through the silence of the room. Sung Woo froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. "Sun Hee?" "He did it!" she screamed, her voice rising in a panicked, desperate crescendo. She ran to her father, throwing herself into his lap and clinging to his lapels as if she were drowning. "The man with the silver lighter! I saw him, Papa, under the desk. I saw him talking to the bad men. I saw him put the black box in the drawer." Kenji's face went white, the mask of the loyal soldier crumbling to reveal the cold, jagged bone of the traitor underneath. "The child is delusional, Sung Woo. She's traumatized. She doesn't know what she's—" "I saw you!" Sun Hee turned, her face twisted in a mask of heartbreak and truth. "You smiled. You smiled when the man shot Emmy. You said the shield was gone." The air in the room turned to ice. Sung Woo looked from his daughter's tear-streaked face to Kenji, who had instinctively reached for the weapon concealed beneath his tailored suit jacket. The silence that followed was the most dangerous thing Joel had ever tried to protect them from.
In that moment, the evidence on the tablet, the bank transfers, and the secret meetings all dissolved into the lies they were. Sung-woo didn't need a digital trail. He looked into his daughter's eyes, the moral compass of his world, and he saw the truth he had been too proud and too broken to see. He had thrown away his shield to please a snake. "The silver lighter, Kenji," Sung-woo said, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the floorboards vibrate. It wasn't the voice of a grieving father anymore. It was the voice of the man who had built an empire on blood and iron. "The silver lighter, Kenji." Kenji took a step back. His eyes darted toward the window where the midnight breach was supposed to begin. He knew the game was over. The quiet sacrifice of the bodyguard was being replaced by the emotional truth of the child. "You always were a fool for her, Sung-woo," Kenji spat, his voice losing its silk and turning to acid. "You let a 5-year-old and a mute bodyguard run your empire. You deserve what's coming at midnight." As the first alarm of the perimeter breach began to wail in the distance, Sun-hee buried her face in her father's chest, sobbing for the man they had lost. Sung-woo held her tight, his eyes fixed on the door. He finally knew who had pulled the trigger, but as he looked at the empty post where Joel used to stand, he realized that knowing the truth was only half the battle. Now he had to survive the night without the only man who could have saved them. The roar of the rain outside was suddenly eclipsed by the sound of gunfire from the east wing. But for Sung-woo, the loudest sound was the echo of his own voice in the study that morning. "Take what's left of your dignity and disappear." The memory burned worse than any physical wound. As he held Sun-hee tightly against his chest, the realization of his catastrophic failure crashed over him. He hadn't just fired a bodyguard, he had dismantled the only shield that truly cared for his family's lives. He understood now why Joel hadn't fought back. A man who had survived war zones and sniper fire wouldn't have been intimidated by a cold dismissal. Joel had stayed silent because the accusation itself was the killing blow. To be called a traitor by the man for whom he had bled was a wound that no amount of logic or defense could heal. Joel's silence hadn't been an admission of guilt. It was the silence of a heart that had finally been broken by the one person he trusted most. "I have to find him," Sung-woo whispered into Sun-hee's hair, his eyes flashing with a desperate, frantic light. He grabbed his encrypted phone, his fingers trembling as he bypassed Kenji's rerouted signals. He didn't call the security hub. He called the one man in the city who owed Joel a life debt, a retired tracker who lived on the edge of the shipyard. "Joel Stanley. He left the estate 4 hours ago." Sung-woo barked into the receiver, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't shown in decades. "He has a leather duffel bag and a wound on his left shoulder. He's headed for the transport hubs. Find him. If he gets on a train or a bus, we lose everything." Sung-woo didn't wait for a reply. He scooped Sun-hee up and headed for the private garage, ignoring the red lights flashing on the security monitors. He saw Kenji's men moving through the shadows of the mansion, but he didn't stop to fight. Every second spent on the traitor was a second Joel was getting closer to disappearing forever. As he tore out of the driveway, the tires of his SUV screaming against the wet asphalt, Sung-woo's mind was a storm of what-ifs. He thought of the wooden tiger Sun-hee had mentioned, the one Joel left on his nightstand. That small piece of wood was a testament to a bond Sung-woo had treated like a business transaction. He realized that Joel didn't stay for the paycheck or the prestige. He stayed for the girl who called him Emmy, and the man he had hoped was his brother.
The weight of the injustice felt heavier than the armored car he was driving. Sung-woo looked at the luxury gold watch on his wrist, the same watch Joel had protected with his life, and felt a surge of loathing for his own wealth. None of it mattered if the man who held the line was gone.
"I'm coming, Joel," he muttered, pushing the engine to its limit. "Don't leave. Just please don't leave." He realized then that Joel wasn't just a protector of the Kehoe family, he was the soul of it. Without him, they were just targets in a cold house. The hunt wasn't just about security anymore. It was about a father and a daughter trying to find the only man who had ever made them feel safe in a world of silver lighters and dark shadows. The rain lashed at the windshield, a fierce amber glow from the city lights reflecting off the hood, as Sungwoo Kehoe raced against time to fix a mistake that might already be permanent. The central station was a cavern of steel and shadows, echoing with the hiss of steam and the impersonal drone of departure announcements. The rain followed Sungwoo inside, dripping from his coat as he sprinted past travelers who blurred into a faceless haze. In his arms, Sun-hee clung to him, her eyes darting frantically through the crowd. Her voice, once locked in silence, was now a desperate whisper repeated over and over. "Emmy! Where is Emmy?" Sungwoo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched his footsteps. He had spent his life giving orders that moved empires, but as he reached Platform 7, he felt smaller than he ever had. He saw the train, a massive iron beast idling with a low, vibrating growl. The doors were beginning to hiss shut. Then he saw him. Joe was standing near the final carriage, his rugged frame looking diminished under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the station. He held the small leather duffel bag in his right hand, his left shoulder hanging stiff and frozen beneath his suit jacket. He looked like a man who had already left the world behind, his head lowered, his jaw clenched in that familiar, dignified mask of restrained emotion. He was a warrior with no war left to fight, a protector with nothing left to guard. "Joel!" Sungwoo's voice tore through the station's din, raw and stripped of all its usual authority. Joel froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He stayed still for a heartbeat, his broad shoulders tensing as if he expected another blow, another accusation. When he finally turned, his eyes were heavy, tired, and filled with a pain that made Sungwoo flinch. There was no anger in Joel's gaze, only a profound, hollow disappointment that was far harder to face. Sun-hee wriggled out of her father's arms before the car had even fully stopped, her small feet slapping against the wet concrete as she ran forward. "Emmy! Emmy, don't go!"
The mask Joel wore finally cracked. His duffel bag hit the platform with a dull thud as Sun-hee threw herself at his knees, her small hands gripping his trousers as if she could anchor him to the earth. Joel reached down instinctively, his large, calloused hand hovering over her hair, but he looked up at Sungwoo with a gaze that remained guarded, a wall built of broken trust. Sungwoo approached slowly, his hands held out, palms open, a gesture of total surrender. He was no longer the imposing mafia boss in a pristine suit. He was a man standing in the ruins of his own pride. "Joel, wait!" Sungwoo panted, his voice breaking. "She told me. Sun-hee saw everything. Under the desk, the lighter, Kenji." Joel's eyes flickered, but he didn't move. "It doesn't matter, Sungwoo. You thought I could sell your life for a price. You thought I could look at her," he glanced down at the sobbing girl, "and see a payout." "I was a fool," Sungwoo said, stepping closer until he was within arm's reach of the man who had taken a bullet for him. He didn't use the voice of a boss. He didn't offer a promotion or a raise. He did something he had never done for any man. He lowered his head, his posture breaking as he looked at the wet platform. "I didn't come here to tell you to come back. I came here to ask. I'm not ordering you, Joel. I'm begging you." The station announcement chimed, a cold reminder that the train was seconds from moving. The conductor's whistle blew, a sharp, lonely sound that cut through the air. "I can't protect her without you,"
Sungwoo whispered, his eyes glossed with tears of genuine shame. Not from the enemies outside, and clearly not from my own blindness. We aren't a family without the man who holds the door. Please, come home. Joel looked at the open train door, then down at Sunhee, who was looking up at him with glossy eyes, her mouth open mid-cry. The emotional truth of the child was a force more powerful than any mafia decree. Joel's jaw worked as he fought the restrained emotion that had been his only companion for the last few hours. Slowly, Joel reached down and picked up the small leather duffel bag. He didn't step toward the train, he stepped toward Sungwoo. The silence between them was no longer the cold silence of the study. It was a bridge being rebuilt, one jagged stone at a time. The train hissed, its doors finally closing as it began to pull away, leaving the three of them standing together on the rainy platform, illuminated by the fierce amber glow of the station lights. The ride back to the Kehoe estate was different from the one that had carried Joel away. This time, there was no cold window glass separating them, and no silence born of resentment. Sunhee sat firmly between the two men, her small hands holding on to Joel's sleeve, as if she were afraid he might evaporate if she let go. Sungwoo drove in a focused, humble silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror, not to check for tails, but to ensure that the man in the back seat was truly there.
When they arrived, the mansion was no longer the clinical, hollow place Joel had left. The breach Kenji had orchestrated had been suppressed by the loyal remnants of the guard, and Kenji himself had been removed, facing a fate far colder than a simple firing. As the heavy iron gates swung open, Joel felt a strange sensation. For 5 years, he had entered these grounds as a sentinel. Now, for the first time, he was entering as a man coming home. They didn't go to the study to talk business. Instead, they ended up in the large, sun-drenched kitchen as the first light of dawn began to bleed through the colonial windows, painting the walls in a soft, honey-colored glow. Sungwoo, still in his rumpled suit, began to do something Joel had never seen him do. He started preparing a meal. He didn't call for the staff or demand service. With slow, deliberate movements, he set 3 plates on the heavy wooden table. I spent so long protecting the empire that I forgot what I was actually guarding, Sungwoo said, his voice quiet but steady. He looked at Joel, who was sitting at the table with Sunhee leaning against his good shoulder. I told you I served the family, not the business. But the truth is, you were the only one who actually knew what that meant. You weren't just the shield, Joel. You were the heart. Joel looked at the luxury gold watch on Sungwoo's wrist, then up at the man himself. The rigid, controlled posture of the mafia boss had softened. The unresolved power was gone, replaced by a raw, sincere gratitude. I don't want a bodyguard anymore, Sungwoo said, sliding a plate toward Joel. The contract is over. From today, there is no payroll, no rank, and no sir. If you stay, it's because this is your home. You're my brother, Joel. And Sunhee, she needs her uncle. Joel felt the weight of the words. They were the final pieces of a broken trust being welded back together, stronger than before. He looked down at Sunhee, who was finally eating, her face no longer twisted in panic, but glowing with a quiet, peaceful light. She looked up at him and smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She reached out and placed her small hand over the puckered scar on his shoulder, a silent gesture of healing. "Emmy is staying?" she whispered, her voice full of wonder. Joel took a deep breath, the tension that had held his jaw clenched for years, finally melting away. He looked at Sungwoo and saw a man who had finally learned that loyalty isn't bought with paychecks, but earned with truth. "I'm staying," Joel replied, his gravelly voice filled with a warmth he hadn't known he possessed. The story of the Kehoe family had been one of violence and shadows, but as the sun rose higher, it felt like a new chapter had been written in light. There was no longer a wall of fear between them.
There were only 3 people, 3 hearts, and a bond that had been forged in blood and tempered by the words of a child. As they sat together, the shadows of the mansion retreated. Joel leaned back, and for the first time in his life, he didn't check the perimeter or scan the exits. He simply closed his eyes, safe in the knowledge that he was no longer standing in the shadows. He was exactly where he belonged.